Will this be recorded?
The first part of the reading is recorded. The open mic selection is not.
Okay, we're good.
Hello and welcome. I'm Becky with Malvern Books. We're very happy to be with you this evening for another installment of Austin Community College Creative Writing Department's Literary Coffeehouse and Open Mic. Our host is Charlotte Gullick, Chair of the Creative Writing Department at ACC, and their featured writer for this evening is Maurice Chammah. Charlotte, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Becky. Thank you so much, Joe. If you do not know this, our co-sponsor tonight is Malvern Books, our co-host, and they are a fantastic bookstore in our community. You can shop online with them through Bookshop and just support that local bookstore, and they are now open for regular shopping. You don't have to make an appointment, but you can. And I've been painting today, and I see I got my glasses, so I'm very classy tonight. Most of you already know this because you're taking classes at ACC, but we do offer a wide range of classes, including children's literature, screenwriting, memoir. Our classes are small, 15 students, and one of the things that we try to do is build community because we're trying to overcome the idea that writers do it on their own. I think that's a self-destructive, dangerous myth, and actually we need community. And that's one of the reasons that the Literary Coffeehouse is so cool, is that we get to have a featured reader of incredible talent and caliber, and then we get to feature students who want to, or any participant who wants to read their work. It's a really nice way to show people at different points in the writing journey. So I'll just make a couple more announcements and then I'll introduce Maurice. And then we have an open mic afterwards. And if you would like to read at the open mic, you put your name in the chat and you have 4 minutes to read. And out of respect for the fantastic guidelines that Malvern has established, we ask that you choose not to read pieces that have racially motivated profanity, torture to animals, torture to people, or sexual assault. You can write those things, but choosing what you read for other people is important, and that's also part of literary citizenship. So classes, sign up now. Our next Literary Coffee House will be after the new year, and that will be February 7th, so we'll have a bit of a break. And I'm really excited to hear Maurice read tonight, and I'm really excited to talk to him about the choice to write journalistically versus to write personally and what that means. Maurice Chammah, if I'm saying it correctly, is a writer and journalist and the author of Let the Lord Sort Them, The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty, which was published earlier this year. He works for the Marshall Project, a nonprofit news outlet that covers the U.S. criminal justice system, where he was on a team that won the 2021 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting. He helps organize the Insider Prize, a contestant for incarcerated writers, sponsored by the magazine American Short Fiction. He lives in Austin, Texas. Welcome, Maurice. So glad you're here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
How are you doing tonight?
Very good. Yeah. I'm excited about this. I had thought a little bit about what I might read and realized at a certain point that I just hadn't really read publicly from the book at all. And so, I'd done a lot of events for the book when it came out about a year ago, but it was usually sort of Q&As about the death penalty. It was less about writing. So I realized that this would be a good opportunity to read directly from the book and then just have that sort of shape the conversation in a more direct way. The writing piece of it, as opposed to the sort of big heady ideas about the death penalty.
Okay, great. So where are you going to be reading? Oh, the name of the book again is Let the Lord Sort Them, The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty. Malvern Books does have copies of it, and we will put the title in the chat. So where are you going to read from tonight?
So I'm going to read from the very beginning, a few pages, and then I'm going to skip forward to what is essentially chapter 1. So you'll get a taste of the prologue and then a taste of chapter 1. And in a very sort of traditional kind of magazine journalism way, it sort of opens with a scene, and then it the second reading will kind of jump back in time to give some historical context for that scene. So shall I get started?
That'd be great. Thank you so much. Thanks for
Yeah,
being here.
thank you. So this is the very beginning of the book. So, sometimes readers will say that give information that you need to know, but in this case, if it's not clear, then I haven't done a very good job as a writer. So this is the first impression. One afternoon in November 1982, Warden Jack Pursley called a meeting of his senior staff. Pursley ran the oldest prison in Texas, which is located a few blocks from the courthouse square in Huntsville, a small city in the eastern part of the state. The Huntsville unit is nicknamed the Walls for the tall red brick fortifications that surround its grounds. The bricks were made by prisoners. Across the street stood the offices of the Texas Department of Corrections, the agency overseeing the state's prisons. On one side of the street, Pursley gave orders, but on the other side, he took them. The staff had all been told of this meeting by phone rather than the usual written memo, and when the unit chaplain, Carol Pickett, arrived, he immediately noticed a pinched mood. The typical coffee and donuts were absent. Pickett asked the head of the maintenance crew what this was about, and that man didn't know either, and together they asked a major who didn't know either. And after 15 minutes or so, Pursley appeared, wearing his usual suit, boots, and Stetson hat. His face was grim. As he passed by Pickett, he murmured, "You're not going to like this." Pursley removed his hat and set it down. "We will soon be having an execution," he said, December 7th, shortly after midnight. Many years later, Carol Pickett could remember the stunned silence in the room, the knots in his own stomach. The last time an execution had taken place here was 18 years before, and nobody in the room had been around back then. In the intervening years, legal challenges had halted all executions, forcing the state legislature to write new capital punishment laws in 1973. The new death row prisoners began filing appeals. In the meantime, Pursley had been asked to fix up Old Sparky, the state's electric chair. His work turned out to be unnecessary. The chair was now stored in a wooden crate. State legislators had feared that executions would be too much of a spectacle, a circus sideshow, one had called it. And so in 1977, they adopted a new execution method called lethal injection. Though the procedure had been developed in Oklahoma, Pursley's would be the first in the country to put it into practice. "I don't know a thing about what we've got to do," Pursley told the group. "All of us have a great deal of learning to do in a short period of time." He read tasks off a clipboard. 2 men would greet the condemned man at the death house. A tie-down team would strap him to the gurney. Others would load the body into a hearse and accompany the vehicle to the prison gate. The warden led the men through heavy iron doors and into the old death house. They walked through a hallway past several small cells where men had once spent their final days. The atmosphere reminded Pickett of a medieval dungeon. The walls were painted gray and there was little ventilation, making it feel as if, quote, all of the air had been somehow sucked out of the room. Through another iron door was the death chamber, where Pursley showed them a wheeled stretcher with large leather straps laid across it. Pickett noticed 3 small windows framed in mint green, behind which the executioners would send the chemicals down tubes connected to an IV line. The chaplain himself was not given a task at first, even as he was invited in the days after the meeting to watch the preparations. The warden was a former high school football star, fastidious about the smallest details of prison management, and he decided to run drills, requiring the many partial executioners to complete their assigned tasks over and over again until they grew rote. They practiced bringing the prisoner to a cell near the death chamber, a room of less than 200 square feet, and then walking him to the gurney. One young lieutenant agreed to play this role during the rehearsals, allowing each of his limbs to be strapped down. He played his part calmly until one day he snapped. With no warning, the lieutenant went into a full panic, fighting off the tie-down team and refusing to go to his own mock death. The team paused briefly in surprise, but then muscle memory kicked in and they managed to force him down. The warden admitted that this had been planned. He had instructed the lieutenant to fight because, quote, a scene like that is always a possibility. And then he turned to the chaplain. Your job will be to seduce his emotions, he said. Pickett chuckled uncomfortably. The plan was for him to be on hand early in the morning to meet the van from death row. The warden didn't want the condemned man to be greeted by yet another gray uniform. If he arrived ready to fight, hopefully a day getting his spiritual affairs in order would be enough to calm him down, making the execution easier on everyone involved. Chaplain Pickett would later tell this story in many different permutations, slightly altering the dialogue and the sequence of events. But that one word, seduce, was in every telling, a hard pebble in his memory that never dissolved. So that's the first. The second sort of skips backward 10 years. That took place, what I just described, in 1982. And what I'm about to read next took place in 1972. On a Thursday morning in June 1972, hundreds of death row prisoners across the country laughed and whooped and rattled their cell doors. They had spent months and even years waiting for the day they'd be led to an electric chair or firing squad or noose, but now the shocking news was making its way down the runs. The Supreme Court had ruled that every death penalty law in the country was unconstitutional. All of their death sentences had been thrown out. In Florida, a prisoner wrapped a guard in a bear hug. In Tennessee, one placed his hands on his hips and scowled as a news photographer snapped his picture next to an electric chair, as though he had conquered this dusty pile of wood and leather. In Texas, a wave of applause rang through the Ellis unit in Huntsville. And when Elmer Branch received the evening issue of the Houston Chronicle, he stretched his arms out of his cell to show it to his neighbors. The next morning, Branch himself would be above the fold in newspapers across the country, pictured sitting at his neatly made prison cot and gazing through the cell bars. Many of the papers noted his crime, the rape of an elderly white woman. Quote, "If I ever get out, I'll try to find a job," Branch said. "I would go somewhere where I would try to make something of myself." The Supreme Court's decision in Furman versus Georgia, which had been joined by Branch's own case, Branch versus Texas, appeared to represent the end of the death penalty in the United States. It was the culmination of a long decline. Since the 1800s, a number of states had been removing capital punishment from their laws or limiting it to rare crimes. In 1959, there had been 124 murders in Harris County, Texas, which encompassed Houston, but only 3 people sentenced to death. And a candidate for district attorney there openly questioned capital punishment. By 1963, the year a Texan became president, polls showed that less than half of the country favored the practice, and Lyndon Johnson appointed an attorney general who openly opposed it. The news of American military atrocities in Vietnam, along with the discovery of German death camps a generation before, had given new power to the argument that governments should be restrained in their authority over life and death. Many European countries were abandoning executions as well. And then I'm going to skip ahead just a little more. Actually, you know what? I think that that's a nice place to stop. There's a bit of hope in there and also a little bit of doom, given what happens 10 years later. And we can talk about that. But sort of tried to make decisions about how to kind of include some hope in the story that is often very dark and depressing. So.
Well, thank you very much for reading from it and very much for writing it. And so I have a cajillion questions and probably will try to limit them to 10. But so I guess the thing that, like, if I want to, so many things, you know, I'm thinking about Julius Jones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who had a stay of execution recently. Does the public's input make a difference? That's my first question. Do you know?
It does. It absolutely does. So I stopped reading there in 1972 when this major news was handed down that the Supreme Court had abolished the death penalty. They hadn't abolished it entirely. They had just said that the laws as they were written around the country were problematic and violated the Constitution. And that meant that state legislatures could go and sort of write these new death penalty laws in order to bring the punishment back on the books. And I interviewed a lot of Texas state legislators, and they, to a man, said they were motivated by the public. I mean, they believed that if they didn't write a new law to bring the death penalty back to Texas, that they would all lose their campaigns in the next year or two. It was just seen as this given that the majority of Texans supported the death penalty in a broad way. And the polls bore that out to some extent, but there's a kind of strange fact here that I try to explore a little bit in the book, that when the death penalty is around, it actually has a much higher popularity, and when it disappears, its popularity goes too. And so people are essentially, they don't know that they want the death penalty until they have it, and they don't care about it when it's gone, right? But the Supreme Court, in making this sort of big dramatic decision against the death penalty, sparked a really major backlash, and it meant that people around the country who had not really thought about the death penalty very much, and maybe had been fine to let it sort of go its way, its merry way, as it had in Europe and in other countries, and just disappear forever, were furious when the Supreme Court did this. When the headline in their newspapers said, Supreme Court says the death penalty is gone. And a lot of voters said, well, the Supreme Court, they can't tell us what to do. And so then they called their state legislators and pressured them to bring it back. So that's all a long way of saying that that's sort of that the public's views do matter. It's a major reason why we have the death penalty. And to the extent there have been individual cases like Julius Jones, which is a recent case in Oklahoma, where a governor has issued clemency and saved the life of a particular death row prisoner, that has been because of public pressure. The public has overwhelmingly pushed this governor to make that call. That said, sometimes the public pushes for it and the governor doesn't agree with them, but it doesn't happen without the public's support.
Okay, great, thank you. That was just like one of the,
of course, yeah.
A takeaway. So like writer to writer, where would you say that the seed of this book was born? Or if are you able to track it?
Yeah, it's very clear to me. It was a little more than 10 years ago. I had finished college and was living back in Austin, which is where I was born and raised. And I was working for this small organization called the Texas After Violence Project, which is a small nonprofit that does oral history interviews with people who are touched in some way by the state violence and also crime. So what that meant practically was that we did interviews with family members of people who had been executed and also family members of people who had been murdered, and built this public archive that was housed at the University of Texas. And I did this for a year, and that unlocked all kinds of things for me, intellectually and emotionally. It made me fascinated by the criminal justice system and by the death penalty in particular as this extreme and very harsh punishment, right, that we dole out as a society, and that sets us apart from many otherwise very comparable countries. And, having grown up in Texas myself, I knew that there was this strong cultural association between Texas and the death penalty. There was this idea that Texans just really like capital punishment more than other people, and there's something baked into our culture that makes us use it so much. And I felt that there were sort of endless things to unpack. I had studied anthropology in college and just sort of realized that I could kind of start applying anthropology to the place that I had grown up. And then finally, that year made me realize the power of telling individual people's stories. So the opening of the book, it talks about this man, Carol Pickett, who is a chaplain for the Texas prison system. And, the book could have opened on a kind of high level discussion of the death penalty as an idea, but I wanted to focus it on this individual person's story, because 10 years ago, I had realized just how much more powerfully individual people's stories can kind of bring you into these often very abstract sounding political topics. We talk about the death penalty, climate change, abortion, but individual people sort of experience these things in a direct way, and it's always very complex, and their individual stories should be the way that we talk about these topics. And I'm talking sort of in several directions here, but this was, I think, what led me towards a career in journalism. I saw journalism as a format for interviewing people and then using the stories that they told to kind of try to inform the public conversation about policy, about what we as a society should do, whether it's criminal justice or another area. But the death penalty always stood for me as like the ultimate symbol of something that we as a society do, something that impacts individual people, and something that I can make a contribution by, spending years developing an expertise in, and then eventually writing about with more depth. So that's the kind of, so this is all to say that I think the book goes back to the very origins of me being interested in writing, interested in journalism, and interested in Texas.
Were you like young Maurice? Were you like 7-year-old interviewing people of some kind of, that wasn't who you were at all?
Not at all. No, not at all. I wanted to be a musician when I was a kid, and I had no journalistic impulses at all as a kid. I didn't get into journalism really until after college, which I spoke at a university recently, and all the students were asking questions that related in some way to their career paths, and a lot of these students were pursuing journalism, and I found myself saying like, oh, well, actually, when I was your age, I wasn't even interested in journalism, so you're already years ahead, right? And I did in college find that I was really passionate about anthropology. That was the sort of type of class that I got really drawn into, and it's not unlike journalism in that you try to understand where other people are coming from and what their experiences are, and you do a lot of interviews. But yeah, that's all to say that as a kid, journalism was a late thing for me, comparatively, I guess.
Well, there went that vision of you as a interviewing people.
Yeah.
So do you have a ballpark figure on how many interviews you did?
For the book?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I made a spreadsheet so this is just a side story, but as a journalist, I'm constantly anxious about how people will feel about the things that I write about them. And there are cases in which the person I'm writing about is a public official or somebody who's done something wrong as a public official, and I don't feel tremendous anxiety about how they feel about what I've written, because they should have known better when they did whatever it is they did, right? But for I don't know what word to use, that like regular people, I mean, people who are not in those sorts of positions of authority, who were the subjects or the victims of violence and things that the state has done, I'm constantly sort of thinking about what they're going to think, and can't control what they're going to feel, but at least want them to feel prepared. And so I would do all these interviews, and then eventually my anxiety about keeping up with people got to the point where I made a spreadsheet of everyone I had interviewed and sort of last time I had been in contact with them, so that I could get back in touch before the book came out and say, remember this time I called you 2 or 3 years ago on the phone and explained who I was? You may not remember, but here's where that went. Now I'm a journalist, or I'm still, I was a journalist then, I'm now publishing this book. And I interviewed for an hour, and in the end, it's really just going to be one sentence in the book, and here's what's in that sentence. And so we can't as journalists tell people what we've written. There's ethical boundaries there, but you can prepare them, you can give them a feel. And so I had that list of people, and it was by the end about 200 people that I had interviewed for the book. A wide array of lawyers and family members and people on death row. I also did a lot of interviewing people on death row via letter, via snail mail, because I could do in-person interviews, but the prison is 4 hours away. And so I did that a few times, but also I ended up having a correspondence with a lot of men that lasted many months.
I don't know if you can answer this. That sounds incredibly diligent and ethical and responsive to the people who you've communicated with and who they've shared their stories with you, to let them know. And like just that in itself is instructional for me. Like I'm a nonfiction writer, but just that the way that you are saying that you honor how people share with you, and that kind of spreadsheet helps you with that, the practicality of when was I last in touch with this person. It's really useful and inspirational. I got to go make a spreadsheet.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk about, I don't know that the same rules hold true for memoir or for creative nonfiction or for fiction. Though I, like maybe others here, read that long New York Times Magazine story called like, Who is the Bad Art Friend? I don't know if any of you read this, and it was all about the kind of ethics of how people use each other's stories. And journalism, I just think it's because it's a profession, and I have this interest in kind of being ethical myself, but also in maintaining the kind of ethical standards of the profession that I'm in, and our almost like reputation, like every time a journalist is famously unethical, I have this sense of like, oh, you're ruining it for all of us, right? And so there's a sense of obligation to the people I'm interviewing, but also obligation to my fellow journalists and writers that in the future, we're giving people good experiences so that they'll do it again. I'll just tell one other quick anecdote to that point. I interviewed men who had carried out executions for the book, about 4 or 5 of them, and they were hard to find. And the easiest ones to find were ones who had been profiled by the New York Times 20 years previously. And now they were retired, but they'd been written about while they were still doing it. And I interviewed some of them, and then towards the end asked, I think just in passing, like, why did you feel comfortable doing an interview? I mean, you know, they, as executioners, know that they potentially will be written about in an unfriendly way by someone who interviews them, given what they do. You know, they're not naive. And 2 of them said, well, there was this New York Times reporter 20 years ago, and she was really decent to us. And the story, you know, we didn't love everything she wrote about us, but she prepared us for everything and was kind. And so then I interviewed her, and I just also like thanked her for being nice 20 years ago. And I hope that like 20 years in the future, me being nice to someone makes it easier for some other journalist down the line. So
I'll call that the legacy of credibility.
yeah.
So how you did over 200 interviews, how did you, and like people have put in the chat, like the language is beautiful. There are a lot of questions there, but also just like taking a very, my adjective here is a very horrible topic, and bringing some beauty through imagery, through the rhythm of it, through the way that you're articulating these things. What was your process of synthesizing the information? And, you know, like this is a terrible question. How did you feel as you're writing? Like, did you feel obligation? Did you feel like, I want to bring justice, I want to shine a light? So 1, how did you synthesize? And then 2, how did you, what was your like tonal approach, I guess?
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm going to write down the word tonal approach so I can like look at it as I'm talking. And well, and I should also say that I want to be careful not to have a terrible answer that goes on for, because like I have a tendency in these situations to like let one thought to connect to another, and like you want to keep it to the like short answer as opposed to like the hour-long answer that's free associative, right? So I conceived of the book in like, there were sort of 2 big core things that I decided about the book and that were integral to just even envisioning it as a book that I tried to keep at the front of my mind all the time. And they were pretty simple. One was, you know, what were the, like, I want to present to readers like big explanatory reasons for the 2 things in the subtitle of the book, the rise of the death penalty and the fall. Just for context here, the death penalty from the 1980s through the 90s up to the year 2000 rose in American life. So about 2 decades, the numbers climbed and climbed. And then starting about the year 2000, there was a peak and it's been falling ever since. So there was a sort of neat symmetry to the history. And I knew that each of those 20-year periods had these big, you know, 5 to 10, depending on how you categorize them, reasons for why they happened, and they're interlinked, and you can debate the effects of one versus the other and how important they are. But I knew that I wanted readers to get that, and I had to synthesize it. The other big thing was telling the story through individual human stories, right? And in terms of structure, I mean, you meet Carol Pickett, the chaplain that I read about in the very beginning of the book. He doesn't really return very much. He comes back a little bit much later, but he's not a central character. And there's a handful of people like him who sort of pop in and out of the text. But there were 2 people who became the kind of lead characters of the book. And as I was sort of developing the original idea for the book, I wanted it to be human story centric. And I also knew that as a reader, it's easy to get lost. If you're like introduced to a zillion people, you have to keep straight and it's hard to remember them all. I just know this from my own reading, right? Most great novels only have, you know, a handful of characters at the most. And the more you pack in, the more you're asking of the reader to make sense of. So I wanted there to only just be 2 or 3. And in the end, there were 2, and they're both lawyers. And I picked them, I'm going to go into the reasons why, but this would turn into the hour-long explanation. I picked them because they, their individual lives and careers touched lots of other people who I could bring in, and all the different people who play some role in the death penalty process. You know, like you meet a woman who was a prosecutor who sent a man to death row, and then in the next chapter you meet the actual man himself who went to death row, and then you meet the family of the person that he killed, right? And so you, through that one lawyer, can hop off to other people, and readers can kind of keep track of things because you have one central person. And then I picked these two lawyers because their careers, in addition to touching lots of people, touched these big picture reasons in clear ways, you know? Like I find that prosecutors, the rise of the death penalty partially had to do with how prosecutors made the case to juries that people should get the death penalty. So then this particular lawyer is that, you know, stands in for that and does that herself, and you can read about her, and it's kind of standing in for all these other lawyers who did, or all these other prosecutors who did the same thing. So that's the big structural thinking that I was doing as I started and I got into it. And then once I decided, you know, a particular chapter is going to be this person's experience and these different things are going to be happening, it was just a matter of trying to write in a tone that was kind of dignified, I guess is the word for it. Like I knew that this subject is very dark, and you could make it relentlessly macabre if you wanted to, but that would also get very exhausting, and no one wants to read a whole book where there's like no hope and it's all so sad, right? So I was looking for any moments of like levity or lightness that I could work in there. And even if it was mean, like for example, you know, in the book I have some moments that kind of poke at then Governor George W. Bush, and I felt like he was a sort of punching up target. I didn't feel bad about including these negative things about him, but there's like some levity in those moments, right? Because he was a somewhat goofy individual in the public sphere sometimes. And you know, any moments of, you know, humor where a lawyer is talking to their client on death row and something funny happens, I like always latched onto that in interviews, because it was like, oh, I can use this in the book to just like alleviate the darkness of all of this. But then also I wanted it to feel like, because I'm writing about so many people's trauma, if I did anything then have a very kind of somber tone, I'd be undignified and so in some way sort of dishonoring their trauma. So that was the kind of balance I was trying to strike between enough levity to keep a reader moving and engaged, but not so sort of wild and silly and like, you know, David Foster Wallacey or something, that it would feel like I was not honoring the experiences of these people. And then one other big thing to say about tone is I like first person. I use it in a lot of my even journalistic writing at the Marshall Project. I've written some memoir. And so it was some ways, I think, kind of surprising even to myself that I early on felt so strongly that the book should not have me in it at all. And so I talk about myself in the acknowledgement section at the end, but otherwise I'm completely out of it. And because every time I tried to write something that included me as a character or in a scene, it just felt like a distraction from the people who had the direct experiences.
Awesome. Thank you so much. No easy task you gave yourself there to, you know, honor and bring levity and some hope. How did you take care of yourself mentally when writing it, if you're comfortable answering that?
Mm-hmm. I certainly am. I mean, in some ways, I think I didn't. Like, I think some of the lessons about how to take care of yourself came to me later when I was finishing and I was late in the process, and I would have these sort of emotionally overwhelming, moments, right? And I, in particular, remember a moment about a year ago when there was an execution announced, and I had never had an emotional reaction to that before. But in this particular case, I got totally overwhelmed and kind of broke down. And I had realized after thinking about it for a little while that what was particular about this execution, about which I really knew nothing, and it was essentially another name, but I read a press release, and there was a quote in the press release from a lawyer, and it was the same lawyer that I had interviewed for the book. And in the book, he witnessed an execution in the early 90s. And so I was having this gut reaction of like, oh my God, he's going to go through this again. And then the second thought is, oh my God, he's been going through this the whole time, right? Like I interviewed him about something in 1993 and hearing it about it now in 2020. But like, this man has been doing this work all the years in between. How on earth did he do this for 27, 28 years? And so just this feeling of like pain for him vicariously, and then also the fact that I had spent so many hours on this particular chapter trying to capture his experience as he became traumatized by watching an execution. I was, of course, taking in some of that and not realizing how much I was taking it in. So, I mean, I don't think that I solved the problem, but I do think that having things you enjoy other than writing about this, and also writing things, like actually doing the physical task of writing about lighter subjects in addition to this, can help a little bit. And I also think that, like I said before, looking for the moments of levity and like having fun with those as much as you can really helps too. Like I said, I don't know why this example keeps coming to mind, but like writing about George W. Bush, I was like watching old YouTube videos of him on David Letterman, and there was just something like so sort of like enjoyable about that, not because there's something inherently enjoyable about George W. Bush and David Letterman, but because it felt like this somewhat lighthearted break from the other material. And so I was like, let's take advantage of the moment, right? Where I'm like exposing myself to something that's like, if not funny, at least like lighter. So.
Thank you very much for talking about mental health challenges. I think as writers, it's really important to have some transparency around that. And
oh yeah, it's real. And it's especially real if you write about dark things, whether from your own past or from other people's lives. Like you can't do it without it affecting you in certain ways. And so it's just a matter of making the kind of like risk analysis of it, and then also being honest with yourself about how you're feeling as you do it.
Awesome. So what are you working on now?
So a few things. I still have I have a day job at the Marshall Project, which covers the criminal justice system. And so I'm working on some long magazine stories about criminal justice subjects. I'm particularly working on one story about a particular man who was, it appears, wrongfully convicted and is innocent of a crime. And this type of story has been written many times before. And so I've enjoyed in certain ways kind of learning that genre of magazine story. And in this particular case, I'm focused on all of the forensic sciences that went into, or non-sciences that went into the way that the homicide detectives solved the crime. And so that's been really fascinating, because it's meant interviewing not just participants in the situation, but also a lot of psychologists and people who, like, for example, the case involves interrogation, like the way that a detective interrogates a suspect. And it's not a subject I've known much about before. And so I can watch or listen to an interrogation and make my own judgments, but they're somewhat meaningless in the sense that I don't really understand what I'm watching. And so I was sharing excerpts with psychologists and then interviewing them and getting their reactions. And that process was fascinating. The last thing I'll just say is that I'm, in my free time and my sort of extracurricular time, I am very fascinated with developing writing. And I'm not sort of deep in the writing yet. I'm mostly at the research stage of writing about my father's life. And my father passed away when I was 19 years old. He had Parkinson's disease for much of my life before that. And he was from Aleppo, Syria, and he was Jewish. So he was a Jew from the Arab world, which is something I'd always known and found fascinating about him. And as I got older, I traveled a lot in the Middle East when I was in my early 20s, lived in Egypt for a little while. And so I'm doing a lot of interviewing people who knew him about his life to try to reconstruct things and sort of learn from that what I can about myself. And then on the way, also learn a lot of history about the experience of the Arab Jews, which is not a sort of experience that's been in the public sphere as much as other sort of narratives about, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or what have you. So that's what's been really occupying my time.
That's super cool. I mean, all of it, and just the personal project. Um,
Yeah, I will also say that I wrote one essay about him that was published a few years ago in Guernica magazine, and it's probably the thing that I've written that I'm proudest other than the book. So.
and it's really cool that the interview skills that you've developed as you lean on family resources. And the other thing that you said that I just find so inspirational is one, the humility of like, I don't know what these, when you're talking about listening to interview, I can't remember exact terms, but like,
interrogation interviews.
interrogation. Yeah. Like, I don't know about that. And so like saying, I don't know about, and I'm going to enlist help. And you said you had psychologists listen to them?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
What an amazing gift for you to share that with other writers. Because I think there's this thing like, I have to know everything if I'm going to write about it. But
right. And you don't, and you never will. Right. And I have found that my own personal writing and my journalism writing has been massively helped by enlisting experts and expertise and sort of asking. Basically, I think there's a lot of people who have a lot of expertise and don't get to share it a lot and are sort of excited to share it. So when you call them and you say, well, this is my family story and I'm trying to learn more, or this is, or you know, I mean, I one time had a conversation with a screenwriter who wanted to do something related to the death penalty. And it was fun to use my expertise on the death penalty to sort of inform them. And so experts, I've been the expert, I've also enlisted the expertise, and it's fun for everybody involved. And so I encourage everyone, even if you're not a journalist, to sort of get over, I know there's that initial fear, and I remember it from when I started in journalism, of just sort of cold emailing and cold calling people like university professors, but you know, they're there on and sometimes I've heard it joked that, you know, if they work at the University of Texas, you know, taxpayer dollars are supporting, you know, their works, and you're a taxpayer, so go call them up and ask them to tell you about 19th century Jews from Syria or whatever it is that you're interested in and writing about. And they may say no, but you know, it doesn't hurt, and you aren't any poorer for it. So.
Well, the other thing that's really beautiful about that is that how it sounds like the way that you're defining expert also means lived experience, not just credentials. And I think that is really lovely for people who like, what am I an expert in? Like, oh, you know, you may have had a similar experience to my father. I'd like to hear your expert opinion. You know, I just love the idea of expanding the idea of who's the expert.
Absolutely. And I love every time I see an interview with a novelist. I don't write fiction myself. My wife does, but I'm so excited whenever I see a novelist say, well, I went out and I interviewed people who had experiences somewhat similar to what my main character was going to go through. And it informed, and an example that comes to mind is the writer Tom Wolfe, who wrote this, you know, doorstopper novel in the 70s, 80s called The Bonfire of the Vanities. And one of his, the main character of that book is like a stock trader on Wall Street who goes to prison. And that is a relatively uncommon experience, but not that uncommon. And so Tom Wolfe called up defense lawyers and said, like, do you know any, you know, really wealthy people who were convicted in a court of something? And they put him in touch with people. And when I was reading the novel, I was like, wow, these details are so weird and evocative and cool. And like, I guess you could come up with them as a fiction writer, but also like how would you? And then come to find out that he had interviewed people and kind of pulled some of these details, also embellished in his own ways. But just that process was totally fascinating to me.
Awesome. That's so cool. I would talk to you all night, but I'm sure we all have lives to live. So I'll just, I finish up with Maurice. If you want to read for 4 minutes, please put your name in the chat or send me a message that you would like to do that. So Maurice, is there anything final that tonight, not like that don't mean that it's a foreboding thing, that you would like to say to, there are a lot of students here, and you've said a lot of really encouraging things and such helpful, transparent, vulnerable responses, but anything, some advice or words of encouragement you would like for someone who feels like I'm just starting out and I want to be better than I am, or anything along those lines?
Oh yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. And I guess the biggest point, and I think I maybe circled around it a few times, and it's something that draws on something you said earlier, which is that no writer does anything alone, and one should find a community. I love the profession of journalism partially because it creates a community, and you can find community in if you're a fiction writer or a poet or a screenwriter or other things too. But journalism, like I said, we have these ethical norms that we talk about. We immediately sort of like have a kinship when we meet in public. If I'm at a party and I meet somebody who says they're a journalist, there's this sort of like shared understanding of what you do that's really nice. And then structurally, you work with editors, and the editors are who make my writing good, frankly. I mean, that I'm like very, honored that you all said that you liked what I was reading tonight. And some of that is stuff that I came up with. Much of it is, but the level of polish and the level of like really thinking about like which moments are gonna like hit the reader and that you should dwell on. A lot of those had to do with my editor. And I was so fortunate to get to work with her. Her name is Emma Barry. And similarly at the Marshall Project, I work with these really amazing editors. And so journalism is a profession where you get to work with editors as a structural matter. And so everything is somewhat collaborative. But I think if you don't do journalism, if you do creative writing, it's all about finding like who are the people who are gonna make your work better by offering you constructive criticism on that. And maybe it's an informal writing group, maybe it's just one friend that you trade your work with. Obviously, if it gets too expansive, you can get a zillion conflicting opinions and it can be hard. So it's about over the years, just developing the relationships where you have a kind of mutual trust and you respect people's opinion, because that is how you go from, the things that you spill out onto the page to the kind of final, beautiful, polished version that speaks to people. I don't think any of it happens in a one-person bubble. So.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
For writing the book and for the work that you do.
Thank you.
And now we're going to shift over. The silent